I remember the morning it started, how still the air was, how the birds sounded nervous, flitting between fence posts, like something had startled them. My coffee steamed gently in my mug as I stood on the back porch of my farmhouse, gazing across the pasture. I'd retired from the army just 5 years prior and had poured my savings into this little stretch of land on the edge of a HOA-governed community in rural Colorado. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. The soil was rich, the view unobstructed, and the quiet had become my closest companion. That day, though, the silence was broken. It started with a low rumbling thud, not sharp like a gunshot or crisp like thunder. This was deeper, more guttural, like the earth itself clearing its throat. Then came the dust. At first I thought maybe someone was demolishing an old barn nearby, but when the wind shifted, a thick cloud rolled over the tree behind my north fence, heavy with the sharp sting of pulverized rock and engine oil. I could taste it. It coated my tongue like chalk. I squinted through the haze, climbed onto the top rail of the back fence, and saw what I thought was a giant yellow excavator cresting the hill. It vanished quickly behind the tree, but that brief flash was enough. Someone was digging, not gardening, not trenching for cables, digging large scale. I walked back to the house and checked the community bulletin site. Nothing. No announcements, no construction notices. I called my neighbor, Ben, 2 properties down. He hadn't heard anything either, but he too had seen the dust, and he too had felt the ground tremble just slightly beneath his porch. Call the HOA, he suggested. I laughed. But not from humor. They'll probably find me for the dust landing on my porch before they answer a real question. Ben snorted. Ain't that the truth? For months now, the HOA had been on a war path over the most trivial things. Resident named Paula got fined for hanging wind chimes. Another man was threatened with lien action for planting native grasses instead of sod. But my experience was more subtle: odd letters, arbitrary warnings, and a sternly worded email about unauthorized fencing on land I'd personally surveyed and confirmed as outside their jurisdiction. I'd been left alone mostly, but the aggression was palpable, especially from a Karen. As Karen Shively was the acting HOA president, a woman who'd once been a real estate agent and now fancied herself the de facto mayor of our little corner of the world. She carried a clipboard like a weapon and had a way of smiling that made your stomach knot. We'd crossed paths maybe twice. Both times she made sure to look at me like I was a stray dog who hadn't been properly leashed. Still, I figured maybe this wasn't her doing. Maybe it was the county or a utility crew. I gave it a day, then another. By the third morning, the noise was unmistakable. Jackhammers, explosions, small but real. My windows trembled in their frames. I walked the property line, followed the curve of the ridge, and ducked through the barbed wire cut that separated my land from the HOA-managed green belt. What I saw made my chest seize up beyond the trees. They were blasting open rock, not landscaping, quarrying. Huge backhoe dump trucks, men in hard hats and reflective vests. A portable trailer was parked to the side, probably a temporary office. There were no signs, no safety postings, no warning notices, and absolutely no environmental precautions. Just raw, violent excavation less than 200 YD from my cattle field. I turned on my heel and stormed back down the hill. I spent the rest of the afternoon digging through county records. Nothing was posted, no permit, no zoning changes, no environmental assessments which were legally required for anything of this scale. And yet the operation was in full swing. It didn't make sense unless they were counting on no one checking or unless someone had pulled strings. I drafted a letter to the HOA requesting clarification. I kept it professional. Years of military discipline don't leave you no matter how dusty your boots get. I hand-delivered it the next morning to the HOA office, a boxy building tucked behind the community pool. No one was inside except for a young woman at the front desk who looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. I asked to speak with Karen. She's Not available today, the woman replied without even checking her schedule. You can leave the letter. I'd like a signature of receipt. That got her attention. She blinked. Okay. 2 days passed, then 5. No call, no response. But the blasting didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. The dust reached my hoft. My dog Brisket started wheezing in the afternoons. I couldn't keep the livestock calm. They spooked at every tremor. My well water turned slightly cloudy. That's when I lost my patience. I called the county. The zoning department had no record of any excavation work being approved. Public Works had nothing. The environmental office hadn't received a single report, which meant one of two things. Either someone had bypassed procedure entirely, or they were lying about what they were doing. Either way, I had the same instinct I'd had every time my boots hit foreign soil. Something was off, and if there's one thing the military taught me, it's this. When the earth starts shaking, you don't wait for orders. You dig. I didn't know it yet, but that quarry wasn't just illegal. It was about to become Karen's undoing. The response finally came, not through a formal letter or a phone call, but through an HOA newsletter slid into my mailbox like a passive-aggressive threat wrapped in glossy paper. Right there in a bold little corner of page 3, it read, exciting new community initiative underway. HOA partners with Stonecrest Development to improve greenbelt infrastructure and raise funds through sustainable resource extraction. I read it 3 times. Sustainable resource extraction. That's how they were branding this disaster. The article was a page long and void of any meaningful information. It used phrases like community benefit, low impact mining, and long-term beautification project. Nowhere did it mention blasting, displacement of soil, or the fact that half the hill behind my barn was being turned to rubble. I stared at the page in disbelief, my jaw clenched so tightly I could feel my MERS grinding. There was a photo, too, Karen in a hard hat, probably unused, and a high-visibility vest over her pressed linen shirt, beaming like she just discovered penicillin. She stood next to a contractor holding a blueprint, both of them posing in front of what was clearly an active dig site. The newsletter made it seem as if everyone was on board, as if we'd all voted on it, as if this was progress, but I hadn't voted. No one on my street had even heard of this until the dust started blowing in. That afternoon, I took a ride down the neighborhood to gather intel. I spoke with 7 residents, 6 of whom were just as surprised and angry as I was. One woman, Rhonda, had been suffering migraines from the low-level vibrations. Her husband was worried about their foundation. Another neighbor, S. Thomas, showed me his koi pond, now coated in a film of grime. But not everyone was upset. One couple said they thought it was necessary to raise funds for HOA beautification projects. When I asked how they knew about it, they said, "Oh, Karen told us at the wine mixer." The wine mixer, that explained a lot. Karen had been building alliances socially, not officially. Invitations went out to the elite few. Those who agreed with her, flattered her, or benefited from her rule. The rest of us, we weren't stakeholders. We were obstacles. I dug deeper. The mining company Stonecrest Development had a barely functional website filled with stock photos and corporate jargon. According to the Colorado Business Registry, they'd been formed just 8 months prior with one registered manager, Bryce Shivey. That last name made my stomach flip. Karen's son. It all snapped into place. Karen had used her influence as HOA president to fast-track a mining contract between the HOA and her son's company. No bid process, no community approval, no environmental study, just a sweetheart deal disguised as a community enhancement plan. And the worst part, it was working, at least on the surface. HOA funds were rolling in according to the vague budget. Notes posted online, but at what cost? I printed everything I found, the business records, screenshots of the HOA budget, a map I drew by hand showing the proximity of the quarry to my property and other homes. I even annotated it with the direction of the dust plume, showing where it drifted each afternoon. Then I mailed copies to every HOA board. member and hand delivered a sealed packet to Karen's mailbox. I didn't expect her to respond kindly, but I expected something. Instead, I got silence. That week, the quarry ramped up to what could only be described as full industrial pace. Trucks rolled in every 30 minutes, hauling away crushed rock. The air smelled like diesel and gunpowder. My cattle started crowding the eastern fence line, refusing to go near the north ridge. My old mare, Dusty, developed a limp after tripping on newly shifted ground. I knew the vibrations were undermining the soil, but the final straw came when I found Brisket, my dog, lying under the porch steps, panting, his gums pale. I rushed him to the vet. The diagnosis, respiratory irritation from environmental particulate. They asked me if he'd been near chemical dust. I didn't cry much after my service years, but I came close that day. Brisket had been with me since my last deployment, a rescue from a base perimeter in Kandahar. He was the one constant after I left the army, the only soul who didn't care that I'd stopped being someone important, and now he could barely breathe because some overbearing HOA queen wanted to fun. New community tennis courts. I drove straight to the HOA office. It was Friday. The door was locked, but lights were on inside. I knocked hard, no answer. I knocked again, a flicker of movement behind the blinds, but still no one came. I pressed my hand flat against the door, looked through the tiny gap between the blinds, and saw Karen walking briskly into the back hallway. So that was how it was going to be. I left a voice message on the HOA line. This is why Daniel reigns from 217 Clearwater Ridge. I now have veterinary evidence that the excavation is causing harm to my animals. I've gathered documentation, including business ties, between the HOA president and the contractor. You have 72 hours to respond before I escalate this to county and federal authorities. I said nothing else, hung up. Then I did what I should have done that weeks ago. I called the EPA. I didn't know if they'd respond quickly. I didn't know if they'd care, but I knew enough to say the right words: unauthorized quarrying, potential environmental hazard, non-disclosed contractor relationship, unregulated runoff. I included everything I could, and I mailed them physical evidence with certified delivery. By Sunday, a drone appeared in the sky over the quarry, not one of those hobbyist ones, a government one, gray, slow-moving, methodical. It hovered for a long time, scanning. I stood at the edge of my pasture and watched it as it buzzed just above the treeing. Then it turned sharply and headed back the way it came. Monday morning, 3 black SUVs pulled into the HOA parking lot. They didn't knock. They walked straight in, and suddenly Karen wasn't smiling anymore. By the time the EPA agents walked out of the HOA office that morning, something in the air had shifted. It wasn't just the dust anymore. It was the weight of reckoning. I watched from the edge of the post office parking lot across the street, trying to look casual, but my hands were clenched around a paper coffee cup, so tightly I thought the styrofoam might split. Karen came out last. Her lips were pressed so tight they practically disappeared into her face. She was trying to keep it together, but her posture betrayed her, shoulders hunched, phone glued to her ear, sunglasses hiding whatever expression was brewing behind those thick lenses. She walked fast, faster than she ever moved at the HOA meetings or community events, where she usually strutted like she owned the zip code. But today she looked like someone chasing an escape hatch that had just vanished. That night, the quarry didn't operate. For the first time in weeks, my farm was still. I walked the pasture at dusk, Brisket beside me, slow but stronger. The crickets were back, so were the owls. I stood on the ridge overlooking the excavation site now. Quiet machines idling in the dark, floodlights turned off, trailers closed. I took a breath. It felt like I was finally getting oxygen again, but the reprieve didn't last. By Wednesday, trucks were back, slower now and fewer, but back nonetheless. The sounds were muffled, the operations hidden more carefully. They'd changed the approach. Working only in daylight. No more explosions, just endless grinding and hauling. It was meant to be quieter. More discreet, but it still shook the ground, still poisoned the air. And now, I was angry. They weren't stopping. Even under investigation, even with EPA attention, they were still harvesting. Rock behind my back. Bens leaching profit from soil that didn't belong to them, soil they had no legal right to extract from. The documents I dug up made it clear the HOA didn't own that land. It was part of the community green belt common area maintained under trust, not personal authority. The HOA could regulate it, maintain it, trim it, but not exploit it for commercial gain, and certainly not without full homeowner approval. I wasn't just watching them destroy land. I was watching them violate the very bylaws they claim to uphold when they find us for porch flags or mismatched garage paint. That irony tasted bitter. I started photographing everything. Every truck license plate, every shift change, every dust plume and crack forming along my fence line. I installed a trail cam facing the edge of the quarry where their vehicles rolled in. I even used a soil probe and began sampling runoff water from my drainage ditch, the shallow creek that ran behind. The property had gone from crystal clear to murky brown, and I could smell the shift, that mix of clay and something metallic, something wrong. Meanwhile, my neighbors grew restless. Ben came over with a printout of his home insurance policy. He was worried about foundation damage. They're blasting under my kids' bedrooms, he muttered, half in disbelief, half in resignation. I read the clause. If damage came from unpermitted commercial activity, insurance wouldn't cover it. He was screwed. We all were. Rhonda, the migraine sufferer, started collecting medical reports. Thomas H. had started a log of animal deaths in his pond. I helped him dig up a dead frog to check for residue. His hands trembled as he held it. This isn't just inconvenience anymore, he said quietly. This is a threat. Still, the HOA said nothing, not a word. The newsletter skipped any mention of the quarry entirely. Karen had gone silent. She canceled the monthly meeting with the vague excuse of ongoing community evaluations. Bryce, her son, was never seen in person, only as a name on the side of trucks or documents. He was a ghost with a backhoe. I knew what they were doing. Delay, obfuscate, profit. Every day that passed without formal legal consequence was money in their pockets. Quarry stone in this region sold at a premium. I looked it up. Crushed granite could go for $80 a ton, and they were moving truckloads per hour. Multiply that by the number of days and the absence of real oversight, and it added up fast. They were making thousands, maybe tens of thousands a week off land that wasn't theirs, through a contract that wasn't legal, fueled by silence they hoped would hold until the damage was irreversible. But they had miscalculated. One thing I don't scare easily, and I don't let my people go down quietly, not after the things I'd seen, not after the war zones I'd left behind with blood on my boots and my friends' names etched into my bones. So I did something I hadn't done since retiring. I called in a favor. An old buddy of mine from Sheriff Fort Carson had ended up working in state environmental compliance. We'd kept in touch off and on, and I knew he couldn't move mountains overnight, but I also knew he'd listen. I sent him the full dossier, all of it. Photos, maps, soil tests, drone footage, HOA bylaws, business records, the works. 2 days later he called back. I can't make official statements, he said carefully, but I'll tell you this, someone in my office is now very interested in that site, especially after your water samples. What did they find? I asked. He hesitated, then said, runoff contains trace amounts of petroleum residue and particulate silica, the kind that triggers long-term respiratory issues if airborne. That matched what Brisket had been diagnosed with, what Rhonda had been suffering, what the pond frogs had probably died from. It was enough. It's no longer just a zoning issue, he added. This could be a public health violation. He didn't promise me action, but he didn't need to. The wheels were turning now. Bigger wheels. Then, just as I thought things were finally shifting in our favor, a letter arrived in my mailbox. It was official from the HOA. Violation Notice Section 4.2. unauthorized structures within proximity of community easement. They were fined me for my chicken coop. Apparently the coop, which had been in place for 4 years, was now non-compliant due to new proximity rules regarding active HOA improvement zones. They were using the quarry as a reason to attack my property. I stood in the kitchen holding that letter, hands shaking not from fear but fury. They were pushing back, targeting me personally, retaliating, and that's when it hit me. They weren't going to stop until they either buried me in bureaucracy or broke me financially. But I hadn't survived war to be undone by a woman with a clipboard and a vendetta. They wanted a fight. They just got one. I arrived 15 minutes early just to watch them squirm. The HOA had rescheduled the monthly board meeting last minute, probably to limit attendance or hide the mess they were in, but I'd caught the update, hidden at the bottom of the community website, listed in fine print. Next HOA board meeting, Thursday at 6:00 p.m. Community Center Hall B. It was a small room, usually used for yoga or birthday parties. I wore my boots and my army jacket, let them remember who they were dealing with. By the time I walked in, there were already half a dozen chairs filled. Most folks nodded politely. A few, like Rhonda and Ben, gave me subtle thumbs ups. Karen wasn't there yet. Neither were her two cronies, a Dan and Michelle, who often parroted her in meetings like wind-up dolls. I took a seat near the center row and placed a stack of documents on my lap: soil test results, aerial photos, HOA bylaws, and a large envelope marked for record. I was done playing their game tonight. I was entering the board's house, but I was bringing my own rule book. Karen entered 5 minutes late, flanked by Michelle and Dan, both carrying tablets and avoiding eye contact. Karen looked flushed, not in a flustered way. No. This was polished, masked. She wore a navy pantsuit and a white blouse freshly pressed with a gold HOA lapel pin, like she thought she was running for Congress. She took the center seat at the table up front and gave us a tight, measured smile. "We'll begin promptly," she announced, tapping the microphone even though she didn't need it in a room this small. "Thank you all for attending this meeting of the Clearwater Ridge Homeowners Association. Please note, public comment will be limited to 2 minutes per person." Actually, I interrupted. Standing up, the bylaws state that homeowners are entitled to present grievances without arbitrary time restrictions. Section 7.4, if you'd like to verify. Karen blinked. The room turned. She paused. "Let's be respectful of time. We'll proceed." I didn't sit down. "Then let's proceed with this," I said, and walked up to the table, placing the large envelope directly in front of her. "I'm formally filing a community grievance and violation petition against the HOA board president, Shively, specifically regarding unauthorized land use, failure to inform residents, conflict of interest involving Stonecrest development, and environmental negligence. Full documentation is inside, including EPA correspondence." Karen didn't touch the envelope. Michelle leaned over, whispering furiously. Dan cleared his throat, trying to look busy on his tablet. "You may sit down," Karen said finally, cold and clipped. "No," I replied, "I'm not finished." I turned to the audience, my neighbors, some of whom looked stunned, others quietly nodding. "Did any of you vote on a quarry being placed less than 200 YD from our homes?" Silence. "Did any of you approve the HOA entering into contract with a company run by Karen Shively's son?" Still silence, but now angry murmurs. A man near the back muttered, "Wait, what?" I continued. "Stonerist Development was registered 8 months ago. Karen's son, Schwash Bryce, is the listed manager. HOA money is being funneled to that company for quarry services conducted on trust land we co-own as members. There was no bidding process, no transparency, and now there's documented environmental damage, including petroleum runoff and silica dust confirmed by EPA preliminary soil reports. I have a letter from their office acknowledging the investigation is ongoing." Karen stood. "Mr. Rains, you are out of line." "No," I said sharply, my voice cutting through hers. "You're out of line and out of time." Gasps, whispers. rippled through the room. Karen stared at me, jaw tightening. This meeting is adjourned. You don't have the authority to adjourn a public session without board consensus. She faltered, her mouth open but no sound came out. Michelle looked pale. Dan started tapping again, fingers nervous. I turned to the room. If you want to keep pretending this is okay, go home. If you want to be heard, if you want to take back your neighborhood, stay, because I'm not going anywhere. No one left. Karen did. She gathered her folder, snapped it shut, and stormed out of the room with Michelle trailing after. Dan hesitated for a second, then followed. The door clicked shut behind them. For the first time in months, the HOA meeting became ours. Someone brought out the community bylaws. Ben read aloud from section 9.2. About board recall votes. Thomas pulled up the member roster on his phone. People started organizing, not shouting. Planning. There was a quiet shared resolve in the room. We'd been under Karen's thumb for too long, bullied by system that was supposed to protect us. I stayed until the last light flicked off in the hall. As I walked out, Rhonda came up beside me and handed me a USB drive. I recorded the whole thing, she said. Thought you might want it. I smiled. You read my mind. Later that night, I filed a formal complaint to the Shish State HOA Regulatory Board. Attached the recording, uploaded the EPA letters, forwarded it to a journalist I'd worked with during a veteran housing campaign 2 years prior, titled The Email Conflict of Interest and Community Risk Clearwater Ridge Quarry Project. 2 days later, I got a reply, and this is exactly the kind of thing we've been trying to expose. You have our full attention. Interview, I wrote back, name the time. By the weekend, a reporter from Channel 9 News pulled into my gravel driveway, camera crew in tow, and just like that, the story left the confines of our HOA and went statewide. I hadn't worn my army dress blues in years, but as the local news truck pulled into my gravel drive, kicking up a soft swirl of dust that hadn't been there since the quarrying began, I felt a deep instinct, maybe foolish, maybe prideful, to remind myself who I had once been. Not for the camera, for me. I greeted the journalist, a sharp woman named Layla Jennings, who introduced herself with a handshake that said she'd dealt with snakes before. She had the calm, focused eyes of someone used to cutting through polished lies and PowerPoint jargon. Her cameraman Marcus followed her lead, setting up quickly by the pasture fence, careful not to disturb Brisket, who lay in the shade with one paw tucked beneath his chin. We started the interview there beneath the big oak tree that had marked the heart of my land since the day I bought it. Illa kept her questions sharp. Clear. How long have you lived here? 5 years. When did the quarrying start? About 7 weeks ago. Did the HOA inform you or anyone on your street before hand? Not a word, not even a courtesy knock. And how close is the excavation to your well? Within 300 FT. Close enough that my water went cloudy after the first week. She nodded and looked into the camera. And you have documentation? I do, permitting records, or rather the absence of them, bylaws. Contracts tied to the HOA president's son, EPA preliminary response documents, soil analysis, water reports. In this, I reached into my folder and pulled out the blueprint I'd drawn by hand, the same one I'd shown at the meeting, only this time I'd had it professionally printed. I pointed to the boundary lines marked in red. This land here, I said, tapping the shaded section labeled Green Belt Zone C, is trust land maintained by HOA funds. Yes, but not owned by them. They can't lease it, sell it, or extract resources from it without 75% homeowner approval in a public vote. That vote never happened. Illa raised her brows, then asked the question I knew would come. And how do you know all of this? I looked at the camera, steadied my voice. Before I retired, I was a JAG officer. Army legal. I worked on environmental compliance in Afghanistan and Iraq, places where construction, even in a war zone, had to follow protocols. I saw what happens when people cut corners on land use. How ecosystems die slowly. How water vanishes and doesn't come back. She went silent for a beat, then said softly, and now you're seeing it again. Here. I nodded. We wrapped the interview by the barn with Brisket finally dragging himself up to sit beside me. Marcus knelt to get him in the shot, and I heard Illa say, "Make sure to catch the tags on his collar. Viewers love the dog." It aired that same night. I watched it from the worn recliner in my living room, alone but not lonely. Ben texted mid-broadcast, "Hell yes, sir." Rhonda sent a thumbs up. Even Thomas, who barely used his phone, sent a picture of his TV screen and the words, "Look at you, movie star." But more than the community response, what mattered was what happened the next morning. I received a certified letter from the Environmental Protection Agency, Region 8. Subject: preliminary findings and scheduled site review. I read it 3 times, then I called my friend from Fort Carson. He confirmed the EPA had found sufficient cause to open a formal investigation. There were indications of non-compliant excavation practices, unlicensed commercial activity on protected green belt land, and failure to notify impacted stakeholders. There was also mention of airborne particulate violations and evidence of petroleum-based runoff consistent with vehicular maintenance occurring on unpermitted excavation grounds. The EPA was coming. In full, they scheduled a site visit for the following Tuesday. It would include ground testing, interviews with impacted residents, and a full review of HOA contracts involving Stone Crest development. Karen had no idea what was about to hit her, but she got a taste when the news story aired again on a national affiliate. That Friday, as I walked back from the feed store, I found a car parked crookedly at the end of my drive. Karen stood beside it, arms crossed, sunglasses pushed up into her hair like a pair of horns. She didn't look like the queen of tall, clear water ridge anymore. She looked like a cornered cat. "I'd like to speak with you," she said curtly. I didn't stop walking. "You're standing on private property. I'm asking for a civil conversation. After you fined me for a chicken coop and nearly poisoned my dog." She stepped forward. "You don't understand what you've done. You've brought federal attention onto a private HOA operation. That has consequences for everyone." I turned dead still. "Good," I said. "Maybe now everyone will stop pretending you're a queen and realize you're just a woman with a clipboard and a god complex. You're making a mistake." "No, Karen, you made the mistake. You thought no one would notice. You thought we'd all just shut up, pay our fines, let you tear up land that doesn't belong to you while your son patted his pockets." She flinched just slightly. I stepped closer. "You ever see a desert bloom?" I asked. She blinked. "What deserts? After war zones, I've seen land torn apart, poisoned, burned. But give it time and it heals if you leave it alone, if you stop pretending you own it." Karen looked rattled. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but instead she turned back to her car. I walked away, the gravel crunching beneath my boots as final punctuation. That night, I got a call from an unknown number, a man's voice, nervous, young. "Hi, Mr. Rains. This is I'm not supposed to call, but I work for Stonerist on the Quarry team." My pulse ticked up. "Go on," I said. "There's something wrong with the site. The runoff, it's pooling underground, and we weren't supposed to dig past bedrock, but they told us to keep going. There's a shift happening. I don't want anyone getting hurt." I sat down, heart pounding. "Who told you to keep digging?" A pause, Bryce, but Karen knew. She signed off. He hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand. This wasn't just corruption, it was dangerous. And next week the EPA would see it for themselves. The EPA didn't come with sirens or fanfare. They arrived quietly. 3 unmarked black SUVs that rolled down the main road of Clearwater Ridge just after 9 on a Tuesday morning, turning heads as they passed manicured lawns and flagged mailboxes. No lights, no horns, just quiet rolling judgment on 4 wheels. I watched from my front porch, a pair of binoculars resting in my lap. Brisket sat at my feet, tail thumping softly against the wood floor. He was breathing better now thanks to the air purifier I'd bought and the antibiotics the vet prescribed. But I still kept him indoors most afternoons, just in case the wind turned again. The vehicle stopped just beyond the HOA Office parking with precision across from the Watch Community Clubhouse. 5. Agents stepped out, each dressed in clean gray field uniforms with EPA patches on their sleeves. One carried a clipboard, another had a high-grade air monitor, a third was already snapping photos of the surrounding area. They didn't knock on Karen's office door. They walked straight into it. I sipped my coffee. By noon, the agents were at the quarry site. They brought specialists, geologists, hydrologists, environmental technicians. They roped off a perimeter with yellow caution tape, erected temporary warning signs, and began soil sing near the perimeter fence. One of them showed a depth drill that emitted a low mechanical hum as it bored into the red-brown earth. I saw Karen standing near the edge in her suit jacket, arms crossed and lips pursed like she was sucking on a lemon. She wasn't alone. Bryce was there too. I recognized him from photos, tall with a buzz cut and a smug sort of posture that reminded me of a lieutenant who never saw combat but insisted on correcting other people's salutes. He gestured at the map in his hand, clearly trying to explain the layout to the lead EPA inspector. The inspector didn't even glance at him. An hour later, one of the agents walked up to my porch. "Mr. Rains," I stood. "That's me. I'm SHA Field Investigator Kelly, Region 8. Division. We're conducting an on-site review following your formal complaint. We'd appreciate access to the samples and documentation you mentioned." I let him inside. We spread everything across my dining table: photographs, soil jars, water samples in labeled mason jars, hand-drawn maps, even the audio recording of the HOA meeting Rhonda had given me. Kelly moved methodically, asking sharp questions, and taking notes with the focus of someone who'd seen this kind of thing before: runoff pollution, unauthorized excavation, failure to notify stakeholders. That alone's laundry list of violations, he muttered. But petroleum residue this close to a residential well, that's federal. He lifted a water sample to eye level. "You still drinking from this? Switched to bottled 2 weeks ago." Smart. As he packed up the samples, he turned and said, "Mr. Rains, can I ask what motivated you to do all this?" I looked at him, then down at Brisket. "I buried too many friends in places with no clean water," I said. "I'm not letting my land become one of them." He gave a single nod. By the next day, everything escalated. EPA officials posted a cease and desist order on the quarry gate. All activity suspended pending federal review. The agents installed air quality monitoring stations and deployed water barrier kits around the creek that ran behind my property. They set up a temporary outpost in the HOA meeting room, commandeering it in a sense, and refused to allow HOA board members inside during official hours. Karen was livid. She showed up at my gate the next morning, screaming, not yelling. Screaming, "You've destroyed everything. Do you know what you've done? That land was going to fund our new rec center, the lighting project, the sidewalk repairs." I stood firm behind the gate, arms crossed. "You mean the quarry you approved without a vote, on land you don't own?" Her face turned crimson. "You had no right to go over our heads." I stepped forward slowly, voice low and calm. "You made this federal the moment you endangered drinking water, Karen. You don't get to hide behind budget lines anymore." She spat the words like venom. "You think this is over? The EPA won't shut us down. You don't understand how these things work. People get bored, they move on." I smiled, not out of triumph but out of clarity. "You don't know me," I said. "I'm not the type to move on." She stormed away, nearly tripping over her heels as she stalked back to her car. It took her 3 tries to start the engine. 2 nights later, Channel 9 aired a follow-up. This time, it wasn't just me on camera. They interviewed Rhonda in her living room, Ben outside with his cracked foundation, Thomas next to his drained koi pond. They ran aerial drone footage of the excava on site, now surrounded by warning signs and hazard tape. The narration was damning. Documents reveal Clearwater Ridge, HOA. President Karen Shively signed a contract with a company managed by her son, Stonecrest Development, without homeowner knowledge or vote. The resulting excavation has triggered an environmental investigation by the EPA. Citing potential contamination and legal violations, Karen's photo flashed on screen, her official headshot from the HOA website. The screen darkened, then graphic popped up, pending investigation, federal review underway. The phone calls began the next day. The State HOA Oversight Board, an attorney representing homeowners who wanted to sue, reporters from Denver, even a local environmental nonprofit offering to assist residents with legal support. By Friday, an emergency HOA meeting was announced. The agenda was short: board member recall vote, President Karen. Chiefly, the meeting would take place in the same hall where I'd stood weeks earlier with the envelope in my hands. But this time it wasn't just my voice that mattered. The community had found theirs too, and Karen, once untouchable, was finally about to face judgment. The meeting that night wasn't like the others. There were no floral centerpieces on the folding tables, no trays of cheese cubes or soft jazz playing from a Bluetooth speaker. This wasn't a cocktail mixer disguised as civic duty. It was a reckoning. By 6:00, Hall B was standing room only. People I'd never seen before came in pairs and small clusters, neighbors from further ends of Clearwater Ridge who usually kept to themselves. Some held manila folders, others clutched printed copies of the EPA cease and desist order. Ben arrived in his work boots covered in concrete dust from a foundation job. Rhonda had brought a thermos of tea and a notebook filled with handwritten names and grievances. Even Thomas came early. Came in hand, holding a photo of his dead Koyish, laminated between two plastic sheets. When Karen arrived, the room turned ice cold. She wore all black suit jacket, pressed slacks, low heels. Her hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it looked like it hurt. Michelle and Dan followed behind her like satellites orbiting a dying star. But the crowd didn't rise. No one clapped. No one even stood when she entered. The silence was thunderous. She stepped to the podium, clutching the edge with both hands. "Good evening," she began, her voice steadier than I expected. "Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that Clearwater Ridge Homeowners Association functions under a charter of mutual respect and orderly discussion. I understand that emotions have run high in recent weeks, but no," someone called from the back. "We're done with your speeches." Karen blinked. She wasn't used to being interrupted. "This is an emergency recall meeting," another woman added. "We're here to vote, not listen to you defend your mess." A murmur of agreement rolled through the crowd. Karen straightened, her smile tightening. "Well, under the bylaws, the board president has the right to open and preside. Not when the board president is under investigation for fraud and endangerment," Ben said flatly. Stepping into the aisle, with a printed copy of the state HOA Code, Section 12.3 allows for interim moderation during recall proceedings. Karen opened her mouth, but Dan stepped forward, eyes darting. "He's right," he muttered. "It's in the bylaws." The betrayal must have hit her like a slap. She turned slowly to look at Dan, lips parted, then to Michelle, who took a subtle step back. That was when it cracked. Not her voice, not her hair, her image. All this time, Karen had wielded power not just with rules but with fear and charm. She baked cookies for board members, flirted with the older residents, maintained an iron grip on meetings with her confident tone and rehearsed speeches. She wore competence like a suit of armor, but now, standing there alone, she looked small. For the next hour, the residents spoke. Rhonda shared her migraine logs, dates, times, symptoms. Thomas read his vet's report on the dying wildlife. One mother described how her child developed a persistent cough ever since the excavation began. A retired geologist from the north end stood up and gave a calm, precise explanation of what subterranean destabilization could mean in a residential zone. Then I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't pace. I just read the last paragraph of the EPA's preliminary letter. Based on on-site inspections, evidence collected from affected landowners, and analysis of runoff and airborne materials, we are initiating formal proceedings to Determine whether Clearwater Ridge HOA and Stonecrest development violated federal environmental standard zoning compliance laws and public health protections. Pending review site. Activity must remain suspended. I looked up, and we're supposed to trust this woman with our community's future. No one answered. We didn't need to vote with words. The ballots were printed, placed on the table in neat little stacks. People walked up, one by one, dropped their slips into the transparent box like placing verdicts into history. Karen sat motionless as names were counted. It wasn't even close. 76 votes for removal, 8 abstentions, 1 in support. Michelle didn't meet Karen's eyes as she slid the box away and quietly stepped down from the board. Den offered a muttered, "I'm sorry," and followed. Karen remained alone at the table. Finally, she stood. "I hope you all know what you've done," she said bitterly. "This community will crumble without leadership." "No," Rhonda replied, standing up slowly. "It's already crumbling because of it." Karen gathered her briefcase. "You'll regret this." Thomas chuckled from the corner. "Not as much as your son will." She left without another word. The door shut softly behind her. We didn't celebrate. No one cheered. This wasn't a victory lap. It was cleanup after a storm. But for the first time in months, there was a sense of air returning to the room, of power being redistributed. By the end of the night, an interim board was selected. Neighbors we trusted. Ben offered to handle the financial audit. Rhonda volunteered to manage communications. I was asked to oversee environmental reporting and HOA bylaws revisions. I didn't say yes right away. I wasn't looking to lead. I just wanted peace. But as I walked home that night beneath the rustling cottonwoods, I realized something. Karen didn't just try to take our land. She tried to steal our voice, our confidence, our right to stand on ground we paid for and say, "This is mine." She underestimated us, and that's why she lost. The EPA returned less than a week later, but this time they weren't alone. 2 vehicles from the Guaz, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment arrived with them, along with a deputy from the county sheriff's office and a legal observer from the state attorney general's office. The cars pulled into the HOA parking lot like a slow-moving convoy, deliberate and heavy with meaning. They were here to shut it down for good. I stood by the fence line with a few other residents watching the procession through binoculars. We didn't cheer. We didn't shout. This wasn't the kind of victory you celebrated with noise. This was solemn, measured, long overdue. The EPA agent, Kelly, the same one who'd sat at my dining table, led the operation. I saw him hand a thick envelope to the new interim board president, Rhonda, who received it with both hands like it weighed more than just paper. Then he turned and walked down the trail toward the quarry site, flanked by officers and technicians. The wind was calm. The sky was a muted gray, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. I followed on foot, staying behind the posted boundary. From a distance, the site looked like the aftermath of a failed ambition. Jagged rocks, cracked ground, idle machines slumped like defeated soldiers. A thin layer of dust coated everything in sight. The yellow caution tape fluttered weakly between stakes. Someone had knocked over a generator and never bothered to pick it up. Bryce wasn't there. Word around the neighborhood was that he'd packed up and left town the morning after Karen's removal. Stonerist Development's website had been wiped clean, replaced with a stock error page and a disconnected phone number. He was gone, but the damage he left behind remained like a scar across our landscape. EPA workers moved in with precision, placing permanent shut-off tags on equipment, labeling fuel drums for removal, and mapping out soil remediation zones. One technician climbed onto the tallest rig and sprayed a layer of chemical sealant over a pile of loose gravel, a containment measure Kelly later explained to prevent silica particles from going airborne. I approached Kelly as he was packing up gear by the trailer. "You shutting it down completely?" I asked. He looked up and nodded. "We are official cease and desist orders are backed now by state enforcement. Any further work here will trigger civil penalties and potential criminal charges." "What about the water?" I asked. "The creek behind my land." He pulled out a laminated sheet from his clipboard and showed me a diagram. We've got a 4-phase cleanup plan. The worst of it didn't reach the aquifer, but there's topsoil saturation. We'll bring in erosion barriers and do multiple sediment flushes. It'll take time. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. And Karen, I asked. Kelly gave me a look that said more than words. The state attorney general's office is conducting their own investigation, he said. Conflict of interest, fraud, potential misappropriation of HOA funds. If they find what they're looking for, she won't just lose her board seat. It wasn't vengeance, I felt. It wasn't even triumph. It was something quieter, the kind of justice that takes its time. That doesn't roar, it rumbles. I spent the rest of that day helping Thomas reinforce a section of fencing that had collapsed from the shifting ground. We worked mostly in silence, but at one point he paused, hands on his knees, sweat dripping down his brow. You know, he said, when this started, I figured we were screwed. Figured it was too late to fight, but you, he trailed off, eyes narrowing toward the horizon. You knew exactly what to do. I shook my head. I just knew how to dig. That night I walked the ridge above the pasture for the first time since the blasting had begun. The silence was back, not the strained, uneasy silence from before, but a true stillness, the kind you feel in your chest. The air was clearer. The trees seemed taller somehow, or maybe just prouder. I stopped near the old cottonwood, the one that had somehow held its ground while everything around it shook. From that spot I could still see the quarry, empty now, lifeless, but in my mind I saw something else. Not the scar, but the potential beneath it. Land that could heal, earth that could breathe again. And then something surprising happened. The next morning I got a knock at my door. It was Rhonda, holding a brown folder. We're voting on new land use proposals, she said, community-driven. We figured maybe you want to help us plan what to do with the quarry site once it's clean. I hesitated. I thought. I made it clear I'm not a leader. You didn't lead us, she said with a smile. You reminded us we could lead ourselves. I opened the folder. Inside was a sketch of a community garden, walking trails, a pollinator preserve, an open-air amphitheater. Ideas submitted by kids, families, retirees. No stone extraction, no trucks, just life. You don't have to say yes, she said, but this land's not just a reminder of what went wrong. It can be the start of something better. I looked past her out the window at the wounded ground. I saw Brisket lying in the sun, his chest rising steady and slow. I saw the cottonwood, its limbs outstretched. I saw the place I'd nearly lost, and I nodded. Let's get to work. The fallout didn't stop with the quarry's closure. In the weeks that followed, Clearwater Ridge underwent what could only be described as a civic awakening. Neighbors who had once smiled and nodded in passing were now showing up to weekend meetings, volunteering for cleanup crews, offering legal advice, painting over damaged signs, even organizing block potlucks to reconnect after what had felt like a Cold War under Karen's rule. But beneath the surface of our recovery was something else, simmering accountability. The interim board, led by Rhonda and a small team of residents with actual integrity, began combing through years of HOA financial records. Ben, who'd taken on the thankless role of temporary treasurer, invited me over one afternoon with a thick binder under his arm and a pale look on his face. Dan, he said quietly, spreading the papers out on my kitchen table, this goes deeper than just the quarry. He showed me transfer statements, expense reports, payments made to consulting services that traced back to Karen's personal checking account. There were handwritten notes on the sides of some invoices, little phrases like expedite authorization and covered by special fund. All of it smelled like embezzlement. The HOA dues, we all paid those, meticulously enforced. Fines for trash can placement, mailbox height, or wild flowers that grew too tall, had been funneled for years into pet projects with inflated costs. Karen had been skimming, laundering HOA money through shell services connected to her son's company, and another one I didn't even recognize. Clearview Advisory, another LLC Ben explained, registered to her cousin out In Utah, they brought in an independent auditor. By the second week, the auditor confirmed over 93,000 in improper disbursements over a 4-year span, not including what Stone Arrest had pocketed during the Quarry project. The board didn't hesitate. They filed a formal complaint with the county, and within a week, Karen received a legal summons. It wasn't just about HOA mismanagement anymore. It was fraud, plain and simple. Multiple felony counts, pending investigation, potential jail time. Bryce was named in the filing too, but as far as we could tell, he was long gone. His name erased from every company webpage and public record he could scrub. I thought I'd feel vindicated watching Karen's empire crumble, and I did, but there was something heavier. Too, a sadness maybe, a fatigue from the weight of how much damage one person with too much control and too little oversight can do to an entire community. Still, the neighborhood didn't stop. They fixed what they could. The children's park was repainted. The swing chains replaced, the sandbox refilled. Thomas helped rebuild the koi pond with new lining and native aquatic plants. Rhonda coordinated a fundraiser for air purifiers in homes closest to the quarry. Even Brisket got a new doghouse, handcrafted by a teenager down the street as a thank you. And me, I tried to stay out of the limelight, but people kept stopping by. One afternoon, an older man I barely knew, Henry from the far East End, brought over a jug of homemade cider and said, "I never spoke up at meetings, always figured folks like me don't make much difference, but after what you did, I guess I remember my voice still works." Another day, a woman named Lee knocked on my door with a Tupperware of lasagna and said, "You gave us permission to say no. I forgot we were allowed to. I never asked for that role, never wanted it, but something about seeing these people wake up, find each other, take their street back, it stirred something I hadn't felt since active duty, not a craving for command, a sense of belonging, of shared mission." And then one evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees and the air turned soft and gold, Rhonda called. We took a vote. She said, for what? To name the new community trail through the reclaimed quarry site. I waited. We're calling it Rains Ridge. I nearly dropped the phone. It's not about ego, she added quickly. It's about memory, so we don't forget how close we came to losing all this, and how one person with the right kind of fight, a couple, reminded the rest of us how to stand. I didn't know what to say. I didn't think anything needed to be said. That weekend, we held a community picnic at the quarry site, now a green belt in recovery, lined with rows of planted saplings and pathways marked with fresh gravel. Someone brought a hand-painted sign and nailed it to the fence post. Welcome to Rains Ridge, land restored by community. I stood off to the side, Brisket at my feet, watching kids race down the hill that used to be a dynamited crater, watching elderly neighbors stroll without masks or handkerchiefs for the first time in months, watching people laugh, eat, talk, reconnect. Not once did anyone mention Karen, not her fines, not her threats, not her reign. She had become a footnote in her own story because in the end she wasn't what held this place together. We were all of us, even the ones who'd been silent too long, even the ones who never thought they mattered. We remembered and we took it back. I didn't realize how much I'd been holding my breath until I stepped onto the edge of the old quarry again, this time without a clipboard, without binoculars, without fear. The air smelled different now, fresher, not entirely clean yet. There were still patches of soil being tested, erosion control blankets in place, and signs posted with warnings about sediment monitoring, but something had changed. The land was quieter, softer. It was healing. The EPA concluded their investigation officially that week. A public summary was issued. Multiple violations confirmed, including unauthorized excavation, failure to conduct environmental impact assessments, illegal runoff, and misappropriation of community assets. Charges against Karen were being prepared by the estate prosecutor. Her name was removed from all HOA materials. The court froze her personal accounts. Bryce still missing. No one had seen him, not even on social media. But the silence said enough. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had begun to grow into itself again, not like before, but better. We didn't go back to the old ways. We moved forward. The community trail officially opened that Saturday. The sign Rhonda had commissioned stood proudly at the trailhead, carved from reclaimed wood and painted by local kids. Rains Ridge, our land, our voice. They asked me to cut the ribbon. I tried to refuse at first. I'm not a hero, I said, but Ben just laughed and handed me the shears anyway. You're not cutting it for yourself. You're cutting it for all of us. I stood with Brisket on one side and a girl no older than 10 on the other, holding the ends of the ribbon. The community gathered behind us, nearly the entire neighborhood, some from adjacent communities too, who'd heard the story on the news and showed up in quiet solidarity. Someone counted down. The shears sliced clean through, and just like that, it wasn't a quarry anymore. It was a path. That night I sat on the back porch with a beer in one hand and Brisket's head resting on the other. The stars had returned to their full shine, no more dust in the air to dull them. I watched the glow of solar trail lights flickering faintly over the hill, marking the curve of the new path. It had taken a war of its own to get here, not with bullets or blood, but with documents and determination, with neighbors finding their voice again, with legal codes and federal agencies, with patience. But there was still one more thing I needed to do. The next morning I walked the boundary line, past the cottonwood, over the ridge, down into the basin where the worst of the damage had been done. The scarred earth, the deep ruts, the old machines, still waiting to be hauled away. I had no intention of forgetting what had happened here, but I didn't want to live in it anymore either. I staked the corners of the land I'd bought up from the HOA after the audit. They'd voted to sell it cheaply because no one wanted to hold on to what had become a liability. I offered to take responsibility, not for development, not for profit, but for protection. I bought the land, all of it. I filed the paperwork myself at the Elk County Clerk's office, brought the title home and placed it in the fireproof box next to my discharge papers. That land wasn't trust land anymore. It was mine. The first thing I did with it, I opened a fence panel near the pasture connecting it to the trail. Then I posted a wooden sign at the entrance, carved with my own hands. This land was damaged, but it grew back. So can we. It wasn't poetic, but it was true. Over the next few months, volunteers came in waves. Gardener, students, even retirees who just wanted to dig or sit and plant things. We reseeded the wild flowers, planted trees, built benches. Rhonda helped apply for a grant from a state conservation group. It was approved. We used it to install solar irrigation for the native plant beds. Kids started riding their bikes along the trail. People came with picnic blankets. Woman brought easels one weekend and hosted an outdoor painting workshop. Someone else read poetry under the cottonwood one Sunday morning. It wasn't just land anymore. It had become a place, my place, but also everyone's. And one evening, as the sun lit the sky in soft gold and long shadows, I walked that trail from beginning to end. Brisket trotted beside me, tail up, nose twitching at the scent of foxglove and freshly tilled earth. I paused halfway and looked around at what used to be dust and blast and greed, now trees. Laughter in the distance, children squealing as they played tag along the paths. And at the far end, where the trail looped back toward the cottonwood, someone had added a bench. It wasn't fancy, just 2 wooden planks hammered into shape and painted with navy blue stencils. Across the backrest were words I didn't write, but recognized immediately. Thank you for fighting for us. No name, no plaque, just words. I sat down. Brisket leaned against my leg. I tilted my face to the fading sky, let the breeze move across my skin, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a soldier waiting for the next enemy. I felt home, not just on my land, in my life. And that, more than any judgment passed or case won, was the justice I had been fighting for all along.